Hey again, folks. It's Nicholas here with a 20-minute romp through the hard problem of consciousness and its relationship to Metacrisis and Metatheory. So, what is the hard problem? Or more accurately, what are the multiple versions of David Chalmers' original hard problem of phenomenal consciousness statement? Well, there are at least three versions. How does a matter brain give rise to phenomenal consciousness or conscious experience? Put differently, what are the natural law prerequisites for any system to generate or participate in conscious experiential representation of its condition? Then, if all the behaviors of an organism are accounted for by its matter dynamics, as mainstream science claims, why does conscious experience exist if it does nothing, particularly from an evolutionary perspective? Finally, again, if all behaviors are accounted for by matter, how can we even study phenomenal consciousness? And what does the hard problem have to do with Metacrisis, as represented in some undefined way by this causal systemic cartoon image? Depicting the hard problem, or HP, by this set of green elements, I mean to suggest that the hard problem is entangled with the metacrisis via a variety of complex, diffuse modalities, both connected and unconnected. Excuse me. Then, for the purposes of this brief presentation, I'll try to distill out 5 concrete metacrisis hard problem connections. First, in relation to 2 common characterizations of the metacrisis as a crisis of sense-making and/or meaning, I'll suggest that the hard problem is intimately connected to both of these. Next, I'll show that both guardrailing AI and sense-making, in contrast, what it means to be human, can be enacted in a novel quantitative empirical test for what I call active phenomenal consciousness. Finally, I'll explore 2 different big picture meta-theory linkages of the hard problem. I'll show that leading extant meta-theories, for example, integral theory and critical realism, suffer from what we might call weak internal fractures due to unresolved hard problem issues. And then in a complementary, stronger dimension, I'll argue that a new class of misstep meta-theories establish a far more metacrisis pivotal place for hard problem resolution. Concerning extant meta-theories, I'll illustrate how critical realism is crippled in its very early moves if we don't have a certain kind of mind-to-matter linkage. And I'll show how Wilber's claim that everything's consciousness doesn't in fact resolve hard problem issues in any version of integral that tries to integrate current mainstream science. Now, elsewhere, I've argued for a new meta-theoretical class called misstep, which, as I'll explain in closing, proposes a pre-Big Bang universe-scale misstep. This misstep is the ultimate processual driver of metacrisis and is intimately and inextricably entwined with our current mind-matter confusions, including the hard problem. So on the one hand, this means that advancing on the hard problem can actually dissipate the driver of metacrisis. On the other, it also means that the universe scale driver actively resists hard problem resolution. Okay, so how are we going to unfold and make progress on all of this material? So first, I'll move from Chalmers' hard problem to Seth's real problem, and then show how they're both impossible problems in their chosen contexts. After that, we want to understand alternative contexts in which exploring the mind-matter relationship isn't methodologically impossible. Once we've understood that conceptually, we'll look at what I call the one experiment, which can determine empirically whether we live in an impossible problem universe or not. This then leads to a sort of inverted test, which we can use to find out whether an AI system actually possesses a phenomenal consciousness that can speak or more generally act in the world. Then we'll wrap up with 3 brief meta-theoretic examinations. How critical realism needs a hard problem resolution for epistemic basics, how integral theory needs a hard problem resolution for spiritual insight to speak and act in the world, and how invo-misstep approaches massively level up the significance and complexity of the hard problem for metacrisis response. So to get started, let's move on from Chalmers' 1990s philosophical statement of the hard problem to Anil Seth's 2010 statement of what he calls the real problem, a statement which arguably underpins the present so-called consciousness science movement. Seth says we should replace Chalmers' focus on the how and why questions with a simple focus on mapping the regular, orderly relationships between brain activity, environmental stimuli, and the contents of phenomenal consciousness. Now, rightly, to a degree, Seth makes an analogy with what he calls the hard problem of gravity. Science doesn't ask how or why matter-energy gives rise to space-time curvature. It just studies the orderly features of that relationship. And Seth's approach would then be a complete resolution of the so-called hard problem, were it not for a contextual impasse that he overlooks, as does almost everyone else invested in current quote-unquote consciousness science. So Chalmers' hard problem is set in the context of philosophical causal closure of the so-called physical. Seth's real problem is set relative to current mainstream physics, which is itself a sort of specific enactment of the broader causal closure concept. And finally, we could see any future formulation of Chalmers or Seth's inquiries as being set in what I call dynamically orthodox physics, which is a generalization of the current structural form of physics. And so all three of these contexts, causal closure, current physics, and its dynamically orthodox generalization, share an implication that what I call qualia-valued information, the very building blocks of conscious experience, cannot have any effect or impact on brain activity. And, as we'll see in the next few slides, this denial of impact of qualia-valued information on typically numerically measured brain activity actually means that any recognizable science of phenomenal consciousness is impossible. Okay, so let's look at the conditions for a viable P-consciousness science. By revisiting the matter consciousness hard problem setting I began with, now just adding in a behavior where the conscious experiencer of the tree says, I experience the greenness of that tree. Of course, for any report of greenness to mean anything, to be reliable or veridical, it must in some concrete sense be driven by that greenness. Again, one elemental instance of what I call qualia-valued information. Redness, middle C-ness, and intense painness might be some other examples. Then, what happens if we set this picture in any of the contexts we looked at just now? Causal closure, current physics, or the dynamically orthodox generalization thereof? Well, their common assertion is that qualia-valued information can't affect brain dynamics, so it can't influence any behavior, including speech, but also button presses, or written report, or winking, or any other way for a human to report that they are having a specific conscious experience. Now, that cutting of the causal chain means that verbal report, or any other means of reporting on conscious experience, is averidical or unreliable, which means in turn that it's impossible to have any science that even correlates brain activity with conscious experience, because our strong sense that we can and do report accurately on conscious experience must be an illusion in these contexts. So let's start again and try to find a context in which a science of phenomenal consciousness is possible. Without going into technically detailed definition, let's assert a different context called strongly dynamically unorthodox physics, in which qualia-valued information does influence brain activity and can generate qualia-driven behaviors, such as verbal report. So there's a lot of important technical nuance But the crucial theoretical contrast with causal closure and the like is that under strongly dynamically unorthodox physics, verbal report of qualia is not provably averidical, which is the minimum condition for a methodologically viable science of consciousness. Now, it's important to emphasize that these context prescriptions are, up to this point, conceptual, theoretical conjectures. It's conceptually possible that we live in a causal closure, dynamically orthodox universe, or equally that we live in a dynamically unorthodox one. But what we actually inhabit is an empirical experimental question. And so, of course, we turn to experiment to help us discern our lived reality. This one I call the one experiment because it's the one that either empowers or disempowers all other experiments in P consciousness science. Put simply, it compares actual data recordings from a conscious human brain with a computer simulation of the same brain, but based only on dynamically orthodox current physics. Now, if strongly dynamically unorthodox physics describes our universe, then actual brain activity will be influenced by the transfer of qualia-valued information from phenomenal consciousness, while the simulation will not include the effects of that transfer. So there will, or won't, be systematic divergence between actual and simulated brain data, depending on whether there is or isn't dynamically unorthodox transfer of qualia-valued information into the human brain. Now, assuming, as I strongly suspect, that we do detect the influence of qualia-valued information on the human brain, we can move to the case of AI and invert the experiment, in a sense. AIs that produce no phenomenal consciousness or an inert passive sentience will display internal computations that precisely follow their program behavior. But if an AI generates active phenomenal consciousness, the sort that can generate speech or action in the world, then, then just as in the one experiment human case, we would observe systematic divergence from program behavior. Obviously, this isn't a test for sentience or phenomenal consciousness per se, but it is a test for the sort of active phenomenal consciousness we subjectively believe to be associated with our own intelligence, and which, by extension, might then be the concern for a putatively super intelligent conscious AI. So this has all been kind of qualitative and high level. Perhaps it's engaging, but does it actually hold up under scrutiny? So the main text that establishes what I'm talking about here is called From Gödel to Trump. It's about 300 pages of closely argued theoretical physics and computational neuroscience. A lot of the background material is developed in some sci-arXiv preprints, notably this one developing a new mathematical formalism for qualia-valued information. This one explaining the one experiment. I think that this preprint doesn't actually use, that symbolism. And this one, which deconstructs Seth's real problem approach. And then Seeing Matters, which is also on sci-arXiv, actually as a preprint, which I shared with the recipients of this video, is a book chapter from French and Brogard's philosophical text on representation and visual perception. And this chapter introduces this central formal mathematical approach in a somewhat informal, low mathematics way. Now, of course, a ton of written material doesn't guarantee anything. Well, nothing really guarantees anything. But from the point of view of fides, perhaps, and a declaration of personal positionality, maybe it's useful to overview my 50 years or so of journey into this content. So my initial trainings and default grounding lie in mathematics and theoretical physics. It was in a move into finance and economics that I first concentrated on the disconnect between dynamically orthodox physics and subjectively active phenomenal consciousness. And focusing on that disconnect was part of this yellow star-like spiritual explosion in 2001, which opened a couple of decades focused on neuroscience and spirituality. And then only very recently, via Mark and Bruce's View from Somewhere offering and in Sean's Varieties of Integral course, did I start to explore a meta-theoretical landing point for this prior half century or so. Okay, so let's finish up with some meta-theoretical implications. First, let's look at Bhaskare's original critical realism, which started out as an attempt to establish a form of consilience between natural and social sciences. And as we'll see, trying to create that consilience, congruence, relative to a dynamically orthodox version of natural science leaves these kinds of red fracture lines inside critical realism, reducing its strength and effectiveness as a metacrisis response modality. So the claim here actually follows from an examination of the epistemic foundations of natural science on its own, before even going to the social science integration. So consider a typical and typically uncontroversial component of scientific knowledge acquisition, in which a scientist uses a phenomenally conscious experience of a meter reading, here an everyday thermometer, as part of the scientific process. I know that meter read 98.6 because I saw that it did, she may say to herself or somebody else. But as we've seen, under dynamically orthodox physics, these sorts of assertions are unreliable or averidical. They can't be driven by the conscious experience itself. So the dynamically orthodox content of current physics contradicts any phenomenal consciousness invoking epistemology for science, an invocation which is inherent in pretty much every foundational attempt currently. Turning to Wilber's integral theory, here I argue his approach suffers from an analogous internal fracture line between interior and exterior quadrants, if, again, it asserts inclusion of dynamically orthodox current science. So this fracture has particular significance in relation to the transmission or action of deep spiritual insight in the material world. Here, speaking words such as "there is a light" to communicate that kind of insight or experience, again, can't be veridical under dynamical orthodoxy. Conversely, like any framework asserting the meaningful transfer of not matter-originated experience into or via the material world must incorporate strongly dynamically unorthodox physics. Now, these observations about critical realism and integral theory can be seen as ways to fix internal fractures if strong dynamical unorthodoxy holds in our universe, and so improve their response efficacy in the face of a somewhat mysterious and apparently very powerful metacrisis drive. My closing meta-theoretical observation is of a rather different sort, because it relates to what I've argued elsewhere is a hitherto missing class of meta-theories called inver-misstep, and to this class's conjecture of a pre-Big Bang universe-scale misstep as an ongoing processual causal driver of metacrisis. So, without going into technical details, a central subclass of inver-misstep meta-theories proposes that mind-matter confusion is not just a human-level philosophical or scientific issue. Instead, that apparent division and then subsequent confusion is actually actively promoted by the ongoing universe-scale misstep process, again, from pre-Big Bang era. So on the one hand, this can mean that the human level sorting out of the hard problem and dynamical orthodoxy and unorthodoxy can actually help liberate us to some degree from being enmeshed in misstep and its metacrisis consequences. So on the other, it also means that there can be a powerful and subtle resistance to and interference with that sorting out. by the very universe scale process itself. Okay, suffice to say, this picture points to a new depth and significance of inquiry into how to move forward on the hard problem in the face of previously unimagined resistance. In summary, then, our journey from the hard problem to the real version through impossible and possible contexts to human experiments and AI tests, and then onwards through three distinct metatheoretical contexts and their implications. This all points, I argue, to one conclusion, that a one experiment-driven transformation of current science is a crucial leverage point for metacrisis response, and, relatedly, for upgrading the internal coherence of the metatheoretic field as a whole.